ba da boo, la ba da boo, la ba da boo da boo. La ba da boo, la ba da boo, la ba da boo da boo.
So we're back for chapter 7, After Buddhism, Rethinking Dharma for a Secular Age. This chapter is called Experience. I just want to reiterate what I mentioned last time, which is like I'm finding a lot of value in rereading as opposed to reading ahead. And that was especially true in this chapter because this is like, there's a lot to process in here, and especially since all of the details and names and concepts are all directly about examining our experience. You know, it's like, I don't know that there's a more practical chapter. I mean, if you're not using this to look into your experience, it's a meaningless chapter. You know, there's like no value in any of this unless you're actually looking at how it arises in your own experience. So this one in particular, I found a lot of value in rereading. And so I want to recommend that to listeners. And then the other thought I had this week that I wrote down is that we've talked a fair amount about how some of this may feel a little jarring, like some of the teachings in here or some of the ideas or assertions that he makes. But I'm curious about your input on this too, Mitchell, like, which is like, I feel like most of the times where I'm like a little triggered, it's funny because it's only when he's agnostic on metaphysical points, really. Like, and what I mean is, I can't think of any time, though I might be forgetting, I can't think of any time where he said anything that was like surprising or new to me that was anything other than A, Gautama never said this in any Pali canon teachings, or B, knowing the answer to this is irrelevant to the practice of Dharma. Like, I don't feel like he ever said, like, this thing you learned is wrong. Like, I think he just kind of said, like, any of the times I'm triggered is just because he's saying, like, oh, that's maybe not that important to your practice, or Gautama, the historical Buddha, is not recorded as having saying this in the Pali canon.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah.
Am I forgetting something? Or?
Yeah, no, I think I pretty much agree. We might come to a couple in this chapter that I kind of wondered about. I made notes about it. But I would agree. And like, we definitely talked about, you know, my getting triggered by the content a little bit. In my case, it was me perceiving his voice as a voice telling me that there was something wrong with a system of practice that more or less works and is working for me. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But, and then I think my turning point was to realize how much of this text is just simple and practical. I mean, it's kind of the same thing you're saying, you know, it's like this chapter is a great example. It's really all about the simple act of looking into experience. And yeah, to me, the content is much less triggering, even like for somebody who comes from such a formal Buddhist background, when you recognize that he's really just trying to, I think, get down to the heart of what's important.
Mm-hmm.
There's this message that keeps coming back. So much of the sort of paradigm of the metaphysical truth claims is just irrelevant, you know, as far as what the historical Buddha actually taught. And I mean, to me, that's like pretty encouraging, actually, you know, because like some of this stuff is confusing just outright. Like, I mean, I have questions about it, but part of that is just the fact that, I mean, I'm not even sure I understand what he's saying, you know?
Yeah.
In some cases. And, but then it's like, it's all kind of underpinned by this sentiment that that's really not the main point, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of a good thing.
Yeah. I don't know if this is maybe too simplified of a view, but I guess it's a little bit of like priority shifting, like shifting our perspective to what is maybe a little more, well, as the phrase he uses, task oriented, you know, like oriented to like doing the 4 tasks as opposed to understanding or being able to express some sort of idea about metaphysical truths. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's actually really, to me, like seems like a really good way to summarize it. Like it's about where our priorities are, kind of.
Yeah.
Uh, I do think to me, this chapter was different in that it felt a little more familiar, like kind of familiar
Mm.
territory, getting into some sort of hallmark Dharma topics. But of course, he does sort of I was going to say re-illuminate,
Yeah. Reluminate.
re-illuminate them for us, illuminate them differently,
Yes.
I would say.
Yeah. He's changing the gel in that can, to use some old
Yeah.
theater lingo.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the first time, I would say there's been some points that you had to think about twice already in this book.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say for the first time in this chapter, did I truly have the thought like, man, like I'm just not going to really figure all this out. Like,
Yeah.
like, I mean, some of these are gonna remain unanswered in my mind because like
Mm-hmm.
my brain is just not at this point geared to like hash out some of those deep philosophical quandaries.
Well, and I think he presents it like part of I mean, obviously we'll get into this, but part of the reason I think he talks both about the bundles and name form is that like for any given person in any given moment, maybe one is more useful than the other. And,
Mm-hmm.
and I like just the whole idea of like, all of this is just here for your use, if you want,
Right. Right. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like, I don't know why I just thought of this, but occasionally I will watch Below Deck, the reality show about about the staff of luxury yachts and like their.
Well, I don't even know that. That's interesting.
It's garbage TV, but it's fun, and they have to always take out these toys for the rich people. So and it's like the most annoying stuff because you have to set up the water slide, which is this huge thing you have to inflate, and you have to put out the water trampoline and the jet skis, and there's just all these things, and like I don't know why that my brain works in funny ways, but I was just thinking it's kind of like that. It's like, here's just a bunch of toys, whatever you feel like today is there for you,
right.
but you might just want to sit on the deck and have a pina colada. Who knows?
Yeah. Right.
There's my Below Deck analogy. Last week, Uranus Fudge Factory. This week, Below Deck. We're going down. We're circling the drain here.
I mean, honestly, probably also setting a precedent, if I had to guess.
Yeah.
Like never before used Dharma content.
That's a good point. I should shoot for at least one of those every episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think the last note I had about that was just like, I don't think I've ended up with any new beliefs or ideas in this book, but I definitely feel like I have a much clearer idea about how to practice what I've been taught up to now, directly from my teachers. Like I just feel a lot clearer on that. And in particular, it feels relevant to my everyday experience in a way that it never has before. And in particular, like not having a feeling of like my experience being a little off from what I'm taught, or from the, for instance, particularly thinking about like meditational deities and stuff like that, which I still think are incredible spiritual technology and super useful. But I think I still had like enough of a disconnection that I felt like we were on slightly different paths. And now I kind of see those as the same. So I don't suddenly feel like a Buddha, but I do feel like I'm much better equipped to be one soon and or more often,
Right. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I totally agree. Once I kind of realized that he wasn't telling me anything I was doing was wrong, the same thing happened to me. Like I would specifically like the deity practice is like perfect means to practice the way that he's talking about, for you, if you want to use those toys, so to speak,
Yeah.
I mean, I totally agree. It's made me kind of feel like everything that I learned applies even more.
Yeah. I think I felt guilty for a longest time about all of the numerous instances where I doubted what I was being told. Like the one that stands out to me in particular was like during our pre-retreat training, where we were working on, like, I think we were training on how to fill the bowls on the shrine. And they were explaining why you don't leave the bowls up, why like when you flip a bowl up, you automatically put some water in it. And Lama Tsultrim was explaining, I see you smiling. Lama Tsultrim was explaining how if you just put it down there without putting water in it, these beings called the Gandharvas will populate the bowl, and they live at a much faster time frame than we do. They just move a lot faster, I guess maybe because they're tinier, I don't know. But so they'll build a whole city in there in the time it takes us to fill the bowl. So we have to fill it, you know, before we set it down, so the Gandharvas don't build a city and we drown them. And like,
right.
I remember that moment vividly because like I was there, I was locked into doing the retreat, and in that moment I had like very mixed feelings. Like I was like, all right, I guess I signed up for this, you know, like these beings living in the bowls, you know, like, and I'm not saying it to like knock the, like to say like, I totally don't believe they exist or there's no value. I do see value in a practice like that. But to get back to what I'm saying about this book, like I now don't feel guilty about that anymore because I understand my context, my culture, my civilization is primarily secular. That's what I grew up in. And so it makes a lot of sense that I would feel that way about those kind of things. And I shouldn't feel bad, you know, like maybe there's a way that all this stuff could come to us in a secular context. And then we learn all these other things after we've learned. Maybe that's a different paradigm of learning that we haven't really explored yet that is possible. And maybe that's why Batchelor's life work has led to this book, you know, is so that we don't have to feel bad when we, you know, are a little oddly struck by the you know, basically the equivalent, the Dharma equivalent of the dozers in Fraggle Rock, you know, like.
Yeah. Right. I was just laughing, I guess, a little bit just because of the contrast, you know, of something like that to what seems like such greater priority kind of things.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, I'm not like, I mean, I can't claim to know what's really important or what's not, but like just thinking of from the vantage point now of like trying to practice in everyday life and just like all of the shit that we process day in and day out and like trying to make sense of it all and then like being focused on something like that. I mean, goodness.
Different strokes for different folks.
Yeah.
All right. So if we jump into part one, the epigraph for this chapter is from Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika. And it's a short epigraph. It says, "Were mind and matter me, I would come and go like them. If I were something else, they would say nothing about me." And as I often do, I want to read at least the first paragraph here. Stephen Batchelor says, "Not having been raised in a Brahmanic environment, Gautama as a young man, was unlikely to have been familiar with any ideas comparable to that of a transcendent God. He would not have internalized the default intuitions of theism. Yet his travels through northern India, his discussions and debates with fellow wanderers, and his encounters with prominent teachers would have brought him into contact with such ideas. To present his teaching of a fourfold task, he would have had to articulate a vision of the person and the world that would be conducive to its practice. This project was twofold. He needed to differentiate this vision from that of the Jains and Brahmins, which presupposed an eternal soul temporarily imprisoned in a body, while at the same time positing a coherent framework that described the phenomenal reality of human experience without any resource to such a soul or God. Gautama is concerned with how a person can flourish within the totality of his or her sensorium, which he calls the all. As a pragmatist, he has no interest in claiming that nothing exists outside of experience or insisting that God does not exist. These are metaphysical claims, just as indefensible as the metaphysical claims of his opponents. To adopt an atheist position would lay him open to exactly the same charges he makes against those he criticizes. Instead of making a statement about the existence or otherwise of a transcendent consciousness or divinity, Gautama says that claims to know what is unknowable and see what is unseeable are nonsensical and entirely irrelevant to the task at hand of practicing the Dharma. I see this one really as kind of like this part as being framing the world for us, framing the domain, and the idea that Dharma practice takes place entirely in this domain, this embodied domain, and I think there's also ideas of middle way introduced here, like the basic, I think, life example of the Buddha before his enlightenment, which is, I believe, a demonstration of the meeting place of like eternalism and nihilism. So here, one aspect of the middle way is the Buddha's abstention from asserting an opinion on whether there is nothing other than our own experience, or if there is some transcendent consciousness or divinity that lies just beyond our own experience. And I think I've definitely hung out in both of those zones at some point or another, that like there can't be anything beyond my own experience, or I want to get to that other side where it's all amazing and omniscient and glowing and all those kind of things.
Yeah, that little point there was definitely one of the most noteworthy things to me about this section, and honestly, maybe from the whole chapter. Just like kind of the point which we've kind of already gotten to, but just to have it confirmed again, like that it's not really like the Buddha is saying, for example, that there aren't those things. He's not really saying one way or another. And that's the radical thing. That was like, if we say the Buddha doesn't talk about God, that must mean that the Buddha thinks that God doesn't exist. That's just what our mind does, because it's like, it's got to be one or the other. But he's not really saying either, and that actually is the sort of thing. It's like, even now, like after having been involved with Buddhism for quite a while, that sort of thing gives me more faith in it. It's kind of just like, that's not really what's important, it's like actually a message that I can get behind, it's like, yeah. It kind of, I also just now thought of, because he says that to adopt an atheistic position would lay him open to exactly the same charges he makes against those he criticizes. And that just reminded me of the fact that, like, so much in Trungpa's work, he refers to Buddhism as a non-theistic religion. So he's not saying atheistic. And that distinction, I think, never fully, I never fully appreciated it maybe until now. Like that it's not, he was specifically using non-theistic.
Yes. Yeah. 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 That is, and I don't know that word was ever really coined until Trungpa may have actually coined that word as a way of describing it even. Yeah. Which is great because it's perfect. Yeah. That fits. Yeah. So yeah, we also get an introduction here of some words that Gautama uses interchangeably, like the all, sabe, domain, visaya, world, loka. And then he also introduces to this group dukkha, suffering, and the idea that life itself is something we suffer, and that pain, birth, aging, sickness, death, all of those things, including like twinges of sadness in happy moments, because we know that they're contingent and will come to an end. And the knowledge that whatever good circumstances happen or we're experiencing, it's just a matter of time until they stop. So dukkha, he says, is the tragic dimension of life, implicit in experience because the world is constantly shifting and changing into something else. And that is the all, that is the world, that is our experience. Like that's what we meet with. I shouldn't say that's our experience because I don't want to confuse things, but that is what we meet with and what we consider to be the world. And the origin of dukkha, he says, lies in the very structure of the world itself, not in an emotion such as craving or an erroneous cognition such as ignorance. Now, this may be the place where there is a little contradiction of things we've learned. Like this could be, for what we were saying earlier about like just kind of saying things are irrelevant, or that the Buddha didn't actually say a certain thing, the historical Buddha. This one does feel maybe like the most, not contradictory, but like I feel like this idea of like suffering, being a part of the world and reactivity being what we need to let go of. That's definitely, I think, the most different, because we do hear a lot of claims about, and I've seen even just in the last couple of weeks, like I've seen people make posts or like use the word like suffering, talk about the complete ceasing of suffering and things like that. And it hits me a different way than it used to, because like now I definitely really, I now see or feel validated in something I've always thought, which is like, it's never just going to all stop. That's right. It didn't for the Buddha either, So like I do feel like there if there is one way that it does feel pretty contradictory that I'm changing, it's in recognizing that in fact I do see the suffering more as a part of the world and the reactivity as what is to be let go of, rather than thinking that I'm creating all the suffering in the world. I know I create a whole lot of it. That's for sure. Like, right. But I don't think like I do see suffering differently than I used to before.
Yeah. I definitely thought twice about, dukkha is the tragic dimension of life and all of that. And, he basically says in there, like, suffering is like a built-in part of this world, which is, I believe, in some like formal Buddhist teachings. Like, I'm not going to be able to quote it or recall it exactly, but it's like the sort of the different types of suffering, like the suffering of suffering,
yeah,
etc. The suffering of change, all that sort of thing. There's one of them which is like basically that, like the inherent built-in
suffering of the transitory composite or all pervasive suffering. Yeah,
exactly. So that's kind of how I heard that. But then also part of my mind was like, all right, but like, is that true that there is an inherent dimension of suffering in the world? Or is there an inherent dimension of suffering in our interpretation of the world if we're fixated on permanence? I don't know. Like, it seems to sort of contradict something that he says later, to say that there is an inherent way that the world is other than how we perceive it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I do think he says what you're getting at. Like, I do think he does say that, like, I think the inherentness that he's talking about here, like suffering being inherent, I think that itself is a product of the reactivity, I would say. Okay, and I'm testing this out. I may retract it, but I think the idea is that like, as long as we're approaching things from the effluences of passion, aggression, and ignorance, then of course everything is made of that suffering. But I think he does go on to basically say that can, those very moments of transitoriness and impermanence become the beauty, and the treasure.
Right.
So I don't think there's a conflict there. And I agree with you. You're right. I think I could say at best, like the teachings I've received, many of them on suffering in the world have been at least ambiguous in terms of, is it part of everything? Am I creating it? Which percentage of it am I making versus what just happens, And this feels a little clearer to kind of just say, like, look, as long as we're not enlightened, as long as we're not, in a nirvanic perspective, this is suffering,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like this just at the end of that paragraph too. He says, "Yet the more we wholeheartedly open ourselves to and embrace this tragic dimension, the more we appreciate the beauty, joy, and enchantment of the world, precisely because they are fleeting and destined to vanish."
Yes.
You know.
Yes. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah. One other thing that I just really liked is it sort of like almost falls into this very practical, transcendent, simple category of definitions, like the definition that he at one point uh, sets down of loka, the world.
Uh-huh.
He just basically says that loka is simply whatever goes on.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really like that. Like,
What's
like,
happening? It's what's happening.
I can understand that.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. I want to read the last paragraph in this section. He says, the whirling disintegration of the world is a failing to be deplored only if we measure the world against the eternity, perfection, and unity of an absolute. But when God or God's surrogates are outside one's domain, the world is just what it is, neither to be preferred to nor rejected in favor of something else. Instead of grasping hold of the world in order to preserve it from falling apart, or recoiling from it in order to transcend it, someone who practices the Dharma embraces the world in order to comprehend it. Such an embrace nurtures a contemplative relation with experience, where attending to what is happening transforms its passing into the fertile nirvanic space from which an unprecedented response to the world's dukkha can emerge. That's a mouthful. The standout phrase to me in there was a contemplative relation with experience.
Yeah, that's a really good paragraph. I mean, I could see revisiting that for contemplation's sake in the future.
Yeah, and encouragement. It's definitely an encouraging paragraph too. Yeah. All right. Well, part 2. I'm going to read the first paragraphs here too. There is no exact equivalent in Pali or any other classical Buddhist language for experience, at least not in the ways we generally use the term today. In a more technical sense, experience can be thought of as what psychology, physiology, and medicine call the sensorium. That is, the total character of the unique and changing sensory environments perceived by individuals. Sensorium cum experience is similar, if not identical, to what Gautama calls one's domain. That is, the sense organs in their respective sensory fields. Dharma practice has to do with coming to terms with experience itself through cultivating embodied attention, mindfulness, concentration, empathy, and compassion. A central part of this process entails overcoming certain perceptual distortions that lead to patterns of reactivity that block the flow of the stream of the path. Whether such perceptual adjustments thereby disclose an objective truth is beside the point. What matters is whether the relinquishing of such perceptions facilitates cultivation of the Eightfold Path. In particular, here I love the idea that a central part of this process entails overcoming certain perceptual distortions that lead to patterns of reactivity that block the flow of the stream of the path. There's some very meaning dense sentences in this section. And this section in general is really about experience, but then it also introduces the khandas, which, and I had to look this up, skanda is Sanskrit, khanda is Pali.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I was wondering why we were dropping the S there, but
yeah.
This is where he introduces the idea of the clinging bundles. We've called these the heaps, I think, in previous episodes. And the khanda here means body, and he chooses to use the word bundle instead of body so as not to confuse it with the physical body. But I still think there's something really interesting of the idea that we have these 5 bodies. Like, I think that that has its own way, its own kind of impact for me to think about it that way. And those. But to use his word bundle, these 5 bundles are form, feeling, perception, inclination, and consciousness. And this is definitely a different way of describing these than I've heard. Well, I shouldn't say that entirely. I have heard this way of describing them before, but generally I have heard them more often in the way I think I described them a couple episodes back, where like form, rupa is like what we encounter in the physical world. Feeling is like how we feel about it. Perception / impulse is what Trungpa says, and that impulse is the reaction. So I feel like where sometimes these presentations differ is in perception and inclination. And I think like Trungpa, I've heard him describe perception as being kind of like what here is described as inclination. But to try to not confuse things too much, we have form, feeling, perception, inclination, and consciousness. And the Buddha equates these bundles with our experience, and they are what is to be comprehended. And this whole presentation of the khandhas is not any kind of metaphysical claim. It's just intended to help us be able to comprehend our experience. Similarly, these are not truly separate pieces or separate bundles that we can really effectively examine on their own. But instead, Batchelor says they're more like a spectrum of existence, which starts with the physical world and proceeds through to consciousness. And one quote I liked of his is he says it's kind of like the immediacy of what is happening prior to any bifurcation into subject and object, mind and matter, and any other categories habitually imposed upon the felt primacy of experience. Any thoughts so far?
I don't have too much to add to that, but I was gonna, I had marked the last paragraph of that section as a good one to read.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I also have a question mark, so that might mean that I had a question. But here, I'll just read it and
Okay.
we'll see. Gautama likewise considers consciousness to be inseparable from the rest of the physical, emotional, perceptual, and intentional bundles of which it is an integral part. He makes this point emphatically, though someone might say, apart from form, apart from feeling, apart from perception, apart from inclinations, I will make known the coming and going of consciousness, its passing away and rebirth, its growth, increase, and expansion. That is impossible. In contrast to widespread Buddhist beliefs to the contrary, he refuses to grant consciousness any separate or privileged status within experience. Yeah, okay, so that was, I definitely remember the question aspect. So like that strikes me as a little different maybe than what I learned, or at least the way maybe it has more to do with the way I interpreted what we learned. But I mean that's pretty interesting stuff, and as the sections go on, I feel like he'll clarify that a little more, like how the consciousness is inseparable from these other things as its basis, I guess. And I also like the image of like consciousness as being sort of like the view of the whole thing, I guess, which goes to like what you were saying, like it's all sort of a spectrum, like the 5 skandhas or khandhas are a spectrum of experience, or almost like maybe different elements of one thing or different vantage points, whatever. But okay, so all that to say that my question is just like, what about the whole idea of the mind or the continuity of experience after death? Because like that's so much of that is absolutely part of what has become Buddhism. And maybe the historical Buddha didn't speak too much about that stuff, but it's pretty thought-provoking territory. Like, can mind function without physical components of experience, or do physical components of experience somehow come out of the power of mind? Like in a dream, like You know, is you get what I'm saying? Like, is that still the experience of the skandhas?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. One aspect of your question is, I believe, like consciousness, or an assumption maybe that consciousness continues between lives. So given that, like, do we still have an interaction with Rupa, the first end of that spectrum, or the other end of that spectrum? Do we still have that experience when we don't have a physical body? Right. Is that like another way to talk about? But I think, I don't know like a definite answer to that, but I think what comes to mind for me is that we still have the mental sense, and that mental sense may by habit create what seems like visual sense consciousnesses and auditory consciousnesses. And I think it probably, I'd be curious, that's a great question. But I think it's probably because later on he does get into talking about how consciousnesses arise in response to their objects, you know, like in order to have a visual consciousness, we need to have a visual object. So like that would seem to imply that true visual consciousnesses would go away when we're not embodied. But the mental consciousness seems to remain because there are still objects. Or at least the claim is that there are still there's still rupa happening, you know? Right. But it may only be the mental consciousness that's then processing it at that point, because there isn't of auditory organ, you know, or of visual organ. I mean, it's just my guess, but But I think that would keep those heaps going. You know what I mean? I think that would keep the heaps happening, even between lives.
Right. Yeah, that seems right to me too. And like like the idea of like dreams. You know, it's like, is your body in a dream? You having the image of a body basically still the experience of the skandha, you know? Yeah. And I feel like it is, but I don't know what the real answer to that would be.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think what's funny is like that mental sense faculty. That's probably something we don't think about enough, coming like not having grown up with that idea. But really, like, I don't know that the visual consciousness would make any sense without the mental. Like, I kind of feel like and I think I've heard teachings where they almost describe that mental sense as like the executive. So it's kind of like the five senses are like the lower level workers, and they bring their work to the mental sense, who then like actually like processes it for us. So yeah. And I think that comes up later, right? With the example of people who were born blind and then regain their sight. Yes. Yeah.
Which is kind of a crazy thing to think about.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the other thing in here, the other note I had was just that one of the questions the Buddha refused to answer was whether body and soul are same or different, which I think also relates to your question in a way. And Batchelor says he did not consider such a dualistic distinction a useful starting point for understanding human experience. So I think that would relate, because the idea is like the soul, I think, is what we would consider moving between lives without the body, but that soul continues to experience. And so I think even that question of our body and soul different, we can kind of infer that was also irrelevant to the practice of Dharma. And I think also likewise, Gautama doesn't consider consciousness to be separate from its objects. So the objects of the five senses and the mental sense, like consciousness is the meeting of those two. And I think we talk more about this later on too. The idea that it's because of the interdependence of those two that the consciousness arises. Yeah, that's all I've got for part 2. Let's jump to part 3.
Yep.
Part 3 is really like the bundles in detail. So now we get into each of these, and he points out that there are few canonical descriptions of the bundles, not many, and he conjectures on why that is. Maybe they were like common topic in classes and learning, so like everybody kind of knew what they were already, is one of his hypotheses, but they're not described very often. And when the Buddha does describe them, this is not his words, but I was going to say he describes them in very Trungpa-esque terms, meaning like he uses words to be evocative, like it's not so much the words, it's like he's trying to invoke something in a way, like kind of playing with, I think, our brains in a way, like trying to trick our minds into creating an experience for us in the moment. So the language is very much, when the Buddha describes the bundles, the language is very much like the finger pointing at the moon kind of thing, where it's like, it's not the finger, it's what it's pointing at. And the moon here being whichever bundle he happens to be describing. So it's like he tries to evoke, when the Buddha does describe these, it's like he's trying to evoke a felt sense of each of these bundles. So we have our own experience of the bundles. The analogy I thought of here is, it's kind of like because all five are there, it's kind of like he's trying to get one to stand up a little higher at any given point in time, like, so you can kind of see it, like, oh, it's that taller one right there. He kind of like accentuates in each of these descriptions. And I like that. So for an example of that, when he explains dukkha, he says, and why do we call it form? Because it is deformed. Therefore, we call it form. Deformed by cold, by heat, by hunger, by thirst, by contact with flies, mosquitoes, the wind, the sun, and snakes. Therefore, we call it form. And there is some wordplay in here that I wasn't going to dive into, but we can if you want. But he does kind of make the point that the Buddha is doing a fair amount with like playing with words that sound similar. And that's how he came up with this idea of like deformed, because rupa is form and rupati is deformed. But in any case, he's like trying to evoke what form is, in terms of its like really like its impermanence and its qualities of change. And another way he says we could say it is, because it is ruptured, therefore we call it rupati. So that's a little more like English way of using these words. But the way Batchelor frames it here, he says Gautama highlights the tragic and vulnerable nature of physical existence rather than explaining what matter is in an abstract or proto-scientific sense. In keeping with this pragmatic approach, he wants his listeners to contemplate what it feels like to be embodied in a world that constantly intrudes into and threatens their comfort zone. He also points out that form here is not really an adequate description, because it also relates to colors and sounds and smells. And so Batchelor ultimately says rupa refers to our entire physical sensorium in its totality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That last little part is kind of the main thing that I was going to draw attention to, that kind of final all-encompassing definition of rupa, form. But yeah, I mean, that's really like the main takeaway for me, is just to sort of practically consider the entire physical sensorium. But I really like what you bring up about like the evocative nature of how the Buddha seemed to teach these things. It is very Trungpa-esque. I don't know. I don't think I would have thought of that, but it is like experiential teaching more than an informational teaching, That's cool. And like, I appreciate the way that he talks about like how the Buddha drew attention to the sort of tragic or vulnerable dimension of the physical world and like our experience of it, because like, I just feel like that's very valuable in terms of the impact that ongoing contemplation of it can have. It's like kind of what we started out the chapter talking about. It's sort of like keeps it real to enter into the consideration of the physical sensorium from that point of view, because that is the reality of it, sort of fleeting and always changing. And the more we can like come to terms with that, I feel like the quicker we can get to that place of just perceiving it as it is, I guess, rather than as we would like it to be, And then that's where I feel like that's where we get into what he said at the beginning. It's like the kind of joy that arises because it is the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, I think it reminds me of the question. I think it was in the first chapter where he was talking about the mantra of Chan Buddhism, which is, what is this? Like, it was just asking again and again, like, what is this? You know, and I think we don't do enough of that with our experience. And I think this kind of highlights that in our experience at any given time, there is some element, you know, of our physical sensorium that is in some state of change, you know, and it may be a very obvious, dramatic change, or it could be a subtle change. It could be a change that we are distinctively not recognizing in the moment and reacting because of that. You know, it could be like a false sense of like the permanentness and certainty of something. And that too is impermanent, but like in that moment, that like, I've never expressed this, I think, so I might be making a mistake. I apologize if I am, but I feel like that's kind of one of these heaps, you know, when we ask, what is this? Like, one piece of that is there's something right. that's kind of got the spotlight right now, and it is whirling, to use the language in the book, or, you know, like it is in flux, it's changing, it's deformed, it's ruptured in some way or another. And that's one of the heaps, you know, and then we have each of the other heaps also in play in that moment. But I think that's the value of understanding Rupa is like, and Rupa also, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that also even extends to things like promises, you know, and like ideas. Like, I think like, I think I remember hearing something about how, like, I can't remember what they're called. There's even a name for it, like non-physical forms or something, but. Or
like, yeah, mental formation or something.
Yeah. So there is like, Rupa is not just obviously physical things. It's not just what we feel with our senses, the five senses, the traditional, you know, like physical senses. It's also like objects of our mental sense, you know, which might be like a moral idea or an ethical standard or something. Like, these things can be Rupa that we're experiencing in a given moment too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Buddha evokes feeling for us by saying, it feels. That is why we say feeling. What do we feel? We feel pleasure. We feel pain. We feel neither pleasure nor pain. And so he shows us that we already know what feeling is. I think that's another benefit of this experiential approach, is rather than saying like, let me teach you this new thing, each of these kind of shows like, you already know, you just don't have a name for it yet. Like, let me give you a framework for that, you know? And so I think that's the case here too. He's showing us that, like, we all know what feeling is, and what we may not notice, I think what many people don't notice, is that feeling is always another kind of spectrum that runs from liking to disliking with neutral in the middle. And like, in any given moment, we can call it any number of things, but like, this is one of the ways I've started to practice, honestly. It's just kind of checking in a given moment, how am I feeling according to this, you know, this framework, you know? And it's interesting to see like, oh, well, I feel actually okay, you know, I'm maybe just a little over from neutral, you know, but I don't feel great. This doesn't feel obviously awesome, you know, whatever moment it is, but like I'm pretty good, you know, or, you know, maybe I don't feel super bad, but I am like not totally liking this, you know, like being able to kind of notice the subtleties of the journey from like to dislike, you know, and probably most important, notice neutrality. Notice like, oh, I don't really have any particular feeling about this, you know, and noticing that, because that is also equated with ignorance. So like, the more we can notice when we feel neutral, like that's actually a really good way to wake up and practice, you know, being awake in the moment, is comprehending, you know, what it's like to just be in a neutral state of feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm just kind of struck by, like, both when I was reading this and in our discussion, like how all the, honestly like complex and habitually ingrained ways in which we are out of touch with just such simple things. You know what I mean? As like the physical senses and how we're feeling, and how like, I mean, the Dharma is, especially the way he's presenting it or clarifying it, is just so radically simple. Like, I mean, practicing like this, just like the hint or the prospect of being so immediately powerfully embodied in what you are is just like an exciting possibility, you know? I'm like, it's like a whole new, like, oh wow, like it can just be this, you know? It's like, it's so simple, but you know, but radical. I mean, and also just crazy that that's radical. You know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think modern psychotherapy is in many ways still catching up to this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Another quote I had here highlighted that I want to read is, he says, so the Pali for feeling is Vedana. So he says, Vedana refers to the entire range of possible feelings, with agony at one extreme and ecstasy at the other. A tone or mood is utterly evident, yet weirdly ineffable, embedded in the flesh, but almost impossible to isolate, let alone define. Yet it is an intrinsic, undeniable feature of our experience at any given moment. And I love this. He says, it is the silent and truthful answer to the question, how are you feeling right now? Let your attention rest there, Gautama seems to say, and you will know what it means to feel. It's also validating. That's another thing about this, is it's like very validating, you know, like it's not, I mean, and that, how meaningful is that? Because like we all want to feel good. And so when we're feeling a little bad, like there's probably a big part of all of us that in a moment of not feeling great or being on that, you know, agony side of the spectrum, even if it's low grade suffering, you know, or dislike is probably a better word. Even if it's low grade dislike, we probably feel like there's like less value in that moment, or like something's going wrong. Right. But I think the idea is like, no, if you're aware of your feeling tone, the feeling tone in that moment, you're practicing, like you're doing the Dharma. And it doesn't matter if it's feeling good or feeling bad. Like you're still practicing, you're still doing it. It's working, you know? Yeah,
definitely. If you don't mind, I'm going to just go back and read the last sentence in section 1 again.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I feel like it kind of, it is such a good summary of kind of the things that we're saying about just the simple yet radical prospect, you know, of all of this practice. So it says, such an embrace nurtures a contemplative relation with experience, where attending to what is happening transforms its passing into the fertile nirvanic space from which an unprecedented response to the world's dukkha can emerge. So the phrase that sticks out to me there from reading it and in this context that we're at right now is the idea of the emergence of an unprecedented response.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I feel about the embodied like simplicity of what we're talking about. You know, it's like, wow, that's kind of unprecedented. Like to just be here now, you know, like,
without fighting it or without reactivity. Yeah. And that is the, like that radical simplicity, right? It's like, I think like we are so fixated on actively doing something in response to situations or reaction to situations. But I think what's simple and radical about the Buddhist approach is it's almost always like, no, just be with that. You know, like just you don't need to do anything, but don't disengage either. You know, just really be with that, you know? And I think that flies right over our heads because we're so ingrained into going either like really doing something actively about it or totally disengaging from it. And the idea of actually just being present with something, like doesn't even really seem possible. Like it seems like a platitude until you do it, until you're actually practicing it.
That's a great point. It's like, I feel like we are quick to dismiss it before we even actually do it.
Yeah.
Because it seems like just a platitude, or we equate it with not doing anything, which is stupid. So, why would I waste, but it's not really doing nothing.
Yes.
I feel like that's the nuance. It's like people skip it. Maybe we skip over it because we think it's like basically saying the way to deal with it is to not do anything. That's not quite it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we are, not to confuse things, but like we are doing something through not doing something, in the sense that we are in our mind literally building new neural pathways.
Right.
We're making new habits, but we're doing it through a practice of like presence, as opposed to like actively countering something or trying to prop something up, so we are doing something, but it's through this whole new path of just being with and aware and
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
awake.
That's a great point. I feel like that could be, that's a very useful tool of like teaching or presentation.
Yeah, related to the question we talked about last week about like, isn't meditation doing nothing? Yeah.
Yeah. Specifically for that kind of thing. I never really think to go to that place, but like to talk about the processes that are happening. Like,
yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's very real. That's why they see literal changes in the brain in meditators, and those changes generally lead to, improved focus and greater sense of happiness. And it's just that the method to get there, the method to enact that change, doesn't look like what we've become fixated on through this lifetime and others,
Right. Interesting stuff. Yeah. I had to keep that in mind.
Yeah, me too. Cool. Well, should we jump to perceptions?
Yeah.
So Gautama offers this description of perception, which is sanya in Pali. Gautama says, it perceives. That is why we say perception. And what do we perceive? We perceive blue. We perceive yellow. We perceive red. We perceive white. And so I think here he's saying we know what stuff is. If we just consider vision, we know what things are in our room. Whatever's in our field of vision, we have some idea what stuff is. It's not just a bunch of meaningless data. And that's, I think, where he brought in the Oliver Sacks story. Oliver Sacks writes really interesting books about this kind of topic of like people who have interesting things happen with their brains and how it affects their interaction with the world, in their life. And so what he talks about here is, like you mentioned earlier, people whose sight is restored, or where they were born blind and all of a sudden they have sight, become sighted individuals. And rather than just seeing people and cars and stuff, they have this amazing set of unidentified data. It's just information that they have no idea what it is or what to call it or how to use it, And that's that perception part, I think, is we learn with our sight to recognize, that what a fire is and not to put our hands in there. But like that's I think when we talk about perception in this model, that's what he's saying. It's like it's the meaning in the things we see. We know what it is. Everything's got a meaning. And then we've got these 3 dimensions now of like the rupa, like the thing that's come up in the spotlight of our experience, the feeling, the tone that it evokes, and the meaning. These are different dimensions of a moment of experience.
And just to summarize too, like to make sure I'm saying this right, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, basically what he's saying is the meaning is not out there.
Yes.
We perceive from our side. Perception is our act of meaning making.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there is the assumption that like the perception here is inherent in the objects, when in fact it's
Right.
it's on our side. Like we ascribe those meanings to things. Which the classic example of this, right, is like water, between whether it's us or the fish. That we see something to swim in or something to drink, and fish see their house. Like where they live.
Right. I feel like the perception is maybe like our greatest misstep. Like, I mean, I just mean like it's the place where we like start to go too far. It's like what you're saying. We're so habituated to it that we now assume that the meaning is in the things. You know? And that's like a pretty big faulty step in this whole chain reaction. And like probably also like the key to starting to perceive emptiness, I think, is to work with that, like, because, it's like, oh, wait, that doesn't really mean anything other than what I've started to put on it,
Yeah. I agree, but I would also like, because the thing I immediately thought then too, though, is so is feeling. Like we think a thing is making us feel bad,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
situation, like, or doesn't that person know the thing they're doing is annoying the hell out of me? Like they have to know that annoys me, like when in fact, most of the time when people annoy us, they have no idea from their side that that's how they're making us feel, And
I mean, I guess that kind of just speaks to how it's all really just one process, or like a spectrum,
Yeah.
Like the feeling is like maybe a less refined, raw aspect of perception.
Definitely different. Yeah.
Because it would seem in a way like the feeling could contribute to how we end up perceiving, or like, because the perception is like kind of what we decide on, or like the meaning that we give it, which would be based on how we felt about it.
Maybe. I don't know that it moves in a chronological way like that, though.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. Huh.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, so perception here is that meaning-making aspect. And then we get into inclination. And the way Batchelor describes this, he says, just as Vedana discloses how experience feels to us, and Sanya discloses what it means for us, Sankhara, or inclination, discloses the stance we assume toward it. Experience is made up not only of the impressions and stimuli we receive from the world, which feel a certain way and make sense, but also of the various ways we react and respond to what is happening. And this finally made something make sense to me. When you and I met at KTD, you recommended a book, Tralak Rinpoche's Abhidharma Samukkaya book. And I read that while I was at KTD, and I've gone back to read it because it has a description of the khandhas, or the skandhas, as he calls it in there. And one thing I didn't get is he actually goes closer to this description of the khandhas. And the way he describes it, I'd have to revisit it, but I just remember being confused by this one, because he talked about this one in a way, in my memory, and I'm of course paraphrasing with a bad memory, but like I remember he like had some sort of element of motion to this one. Like there was some sort of principle, like giving energy in this one. And that's what I didn't get it, but now I think I do. Because this idea of like inclining and like creating a way to slide in a certain direction based on the experience. Like now I feel like what he was getting at, and I do need to revisit it. And that is a good book, that, by the way, for listeners or anything, Tralak Rinpoche's, Tralak Kyabgong's Abhidharma Samukkaya. But so these inclinations, he says, condition what is conditioned. So there's a little bit of a cyclical thing going on here, because the inclinations are where we're more inclined. And I would return to an analogy I've used before here about the desk chair on the hard plastic mat, and I think I always use this analogy when I talk about karma, the idea that like when you get a brand new hard plastic mat for your desk chair on the carpet, it will roll anywhere easily. But pretty soon, because you always want the front wheel to be between your feet or to the side of your feet, there's a certain way the wheels end up all the time. And eventually you start to get divots where the weight of those wheels start to push into that mat and it starts to incline to a certain place, and when you go to scoot in because of that incline, you kind of ka-chunk into those divots. Mm-hmm, and so I think this is a good way to kind of think about that, is what's conditioned is that divot. And the more we sink into there, the more it's conditioned that way and the more inclined it becomes. Right. So it's conditioning what is conditioned. And Batchelor says we can really think of them as patterns of habitual behavior that are repeatedly prompted by encounters with the world. So it's this cyclic process where we have an inclination to respond a certain way or react a certain way, probably the more appropriate word here. We have an inclination to react that way, and the more we do it, the more it inclines that inclination to do that again. And so inclination is very much equated with action. We're inclined to act in certain ways, and that means it's also related to our intentions too.
Yeah, perfect. I think that does it.
So this inclinations is another place where I think this is probably I don't know if this is right or not. I was going to say this is probably most closely related with karma, like in habit energy. They probably all are equally, but I think here's the way that we can, with action, like really attack our actions and the ways that we tend to just sort of roll. If we think of the inclination thing, and Batchelor says the challenge presented by the fourfold task is to learn how to differentiate between reactivity, in which one blindly follows a familiar impulse, and responsiveness, in which one chooses to act in a way that is not conditioned by the impulses of greed, hatred, and confusion. So action is not inherently bad, and responding is not inherently bad. It is the effluences, greed, hatred, and confusion, that condition us towards further ignorance or suffering, unnecessary suffering. And there is another take on inclinations in the discourses that he mentions, but it's not spoken by Gautama. These other people in the discourses, I can't remember their names, but they describe it as an inclination towards contact or interaction with the world. Like we're inclined to feel and perceive the world. And like physically, they use a physical example, like our body is inclined to breathe in and out. So like if we hold our breath, we start to need to breathe. And so there's that's another view of these inclinations, is like they're an inclination towards interaction, interfacing with our experience.
Yeah.
And then consciousness, again, the Buddha's description here is more evocative than scientific, but the way the Buddha talks about it, he says, it knows, vijanati, therefore we call it consciousness. And what do we know? We know this is sour, this is bitter, this is pungent, this is sweet, this is sharp, this is mild, this is salty, this is bland. And Batchelor says, such a definition is hardly illuminating. Not only does it beg the question, what does it mean to know? But it is difficult to see how consciousness differs in any way from perception, where he said, we perceive blue, we perceive yellow, we perceive red, we perceive white. Both bundles are described as our way of differentiating one feature of experience from another. We seem to be going around in circles and are left none the wiser about consciousness. So the way Sariputra clears this up, Sariputra at another place says, feeling, perception, and consciousness, friend, these states are conjoined, not disjoined, and it is impossible to separate each of these states from the others in order to describe the difference between them. For what one feels, that one perceives, and what one perceives, that one knows. That is why these states are conjoined and not disjoined. So this, and I think the next chapter, are highly focused on consciousness in this aspect. And what I took away from here is that, like, it's kind of the totality factor.
Mm-hmm.
So it's seen as separate. And I mean, this, hopefully, like, this is not going to be a whole digression, but like, if you think about the kayas, you know, which I think we talked about in the Crazy Wisdom series, like this is the, what's the fourth one? I'm forgetting it now.
Oh, Swabhavaka.
Swabhavaka kaya. Yes. Okay. So yeah, this is like the kayas, you know, we have Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya that we talk about separately, but they're not actually separate. And then we have Swabhavaka kaya to describe the totality, which is also not separate thing. It's just another way. And so my takeaway was this, the way he's talking about consciousness is like that. It's not a separate, like, it's not like a completely independent heap. It's just the way of the aspect of experience that has it all included. Is that where you landed too?
Yeah. I have like written down like the unified whole, something to that effect.
Yeah.
I did appreciate that, you know, the last kind of sentence of this whole thing, which is, he makes this note, Gautama's love of wordplay and puns suggests that he might not be taking the quest for precise definitions of the 5 bundles entirely seriously. Which I kind of feel like is just another way of expressing that ongoing theme of like turning his adherence toward what actually matters rather than getting too bogged down in, you know, categorization or whatever else.
Yeah.
Basically being like, you do know what I'm talking about. Like, you know.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and this also, that makes me feel good about all the stuff we've been talking about too, because he doesn't care about telling people exactly what to think about stuff. He's being extra careful about his language so that the effect of his language is to make Dharma practice easier. And I think that's the whole theme of this book. And honestly, a whole theme of things we've been talking about through the whole podcast, you know, is like, let's be a little more conscious of the effects of our language on the students so that what they leave with is a better ability to practice Dharma skillfully, not more data or information about, you know, certain deities or concepts or ideas, because I think the Buddha knows we incline towards accumulating information. You know, we incline towards wanting to collect ideas and empowerments and all kinds of stuff, you know, and it's like, I feel like this is a reminder that the Buddha felt that way too. You know, like the Buddha felt like we need to be extra careful about how we're teaching so that students leave with the right inclinations and not reinforcing inclinations that are not going to help them. Yeah,
I agree.
So the last point from here I want to point out is I like how the idea he gives that we can try to examine each of these bundles one at a time, but it just takes us out of the immediacy of experience. So like we can try to just feel, but then we're no longer like actually present, you know, like, so we have to actually kind of have all of these in the totality to really be present. There's another reason to not try to get too hung up on like, how do I just only feel the perception, you know, how do I only perceive, you know?
Yeah.
And the last quote I had here was related to the idea of being able to examine one at a time. He says, whatever I gain in abstract clarity by this exercise, I lose in sensory presence. That was just him summing up, I think, what I was saying. So we still got a fair amount to go through. Let's close the curtain on this episode, and then we can pick up with part 2.
Sounds good.
Listeners, viewers, we'll see you next week. Peace.